Hello, and welcome to week 16 of our 2-year Bible study. This week, we're going to take a look at Leviticus 12 through 19. As we get to Leviticus chapter 12, it's important for us to recognize really bring up the question, if God commanded humanity to be fruitful and to multiply, then why are women unclean with childbirth? And in order to be able to address that, I want to go back to what we had talked about last week. And I've made a little chart here for us so that we can see it. Clean and unclean really are tied to holiness. So obviously, all sin is unclean and requires confession of forgiveness through sacrifice. But not everything that made a person unclean was sinful. It just wasn't worthy of being sanctified to holiness. And so, as you can see from the chart, the unclean could, in fact, be cleansed. And through that cleansing and through sacrifice, it could be sanctified. And through that sanctifying sacrifice, it could be made holy. And that holiness was what was required in order to be in the very presence of God, or to be used as an instrument of worship to God. However, once somebody left that vicinity, that place of worship, they became common. Now, common is not bad. It just means that they're not yet prepared to go back into the holy presence of God. And if they remained clean, then if they wanted to once again go into the presence of God or be used as his instrument of worship, they had to have the sanctifying sacrifice, and then they could be in the midst of holiness. And so that covenant living was intended to be that kind of left hand cycle that you see. But of course, there are many different ways for one to become polluted. And polluted, again, is not necessarily sinful. It just means that the person has become unclean. And because they are unclean, they are not able to be in the presence of God's holiness and needed to be cleansed and sanctified before they could go back into his presence. Well, as we take a look at this particular passage in Leviticus 12, it clearly is not discriminatory. There were very natural physical experiences of men that made them unclean as well. We're going to see that as we go through our study here today. But in order to be sanctified and holy, one needed to be whole and representative of God's nature. And throughout the laws, we see that blood flow and other bodily secretions meant that life was leaving a person, ultimately possibly leading to death. So if a person bled enough or lost enough um, of body secretions, then it would lead to death. And that death is incompatible with the nature of God, who's the source of life. But notice in chapter 12 that there is no confession of sin that is necessary on the part of the woman who is given childbirth. Additionally, notice that the child is not unclean. And this is unlike other cultic practices of this particular time frame. In other cultic religions, not only was the mother unclean through childbirth, but the child was unclean as well, and sacrifices and ritual had to be done for both. And we know that the child is not unclean because the male child can be brought right into God's presence on the 8th day without any kind of ritual cleansing, no kind of sacrifice is necessary. And circumcision itself, which is what was done on the 8th day, is not a cleansing rite, since that would mean that all women are always unclean, which the law clearly implies is not true. So since we know that women are clean, female children are, and infants are clean, male infants and children are clean, the child themselves is not unclean through the childbirth. So we really have to kind of go back to understand, why is this an area of uncleanness? Well, only what is healthy and whole can come into God's presence, and only one blood could be present in his place of worship. So anything, including or resembling bleeding, suggested incompleteness, a loss of life, and therefore was unclean. And so therefore the mother is unclean after childbirth. Now, again, this doesn't mean sinful, but it does mean that there is a cleansing that is necessary, a sanctifying sacrifice that is necessary in order for the woman to come back into the presence of God. So why the double time for female babies? And we don't have really good answers for this, but I think some suggestions can be offered. It's certainly not about more defilement because of inferiority of gender. This is not a gender inferiority or superiority issue that is going on here. Uncleanness is never linked to social status or gender status anywhere in the law. And the cleansing rituals are the same for both men and women. And so there is an equality that when we kind of strip away our cultural biases, we see that there is a considerable amount of equality that God is placing men and women, especially as they come into his presence. Now, one answer for the double time might be that since the daughter will naturally menstruate eventually, the mother is kind of taking upon herself the defilement of the daughter on her behalf until she is able to do it for herself. And so it's kind of almost a substitutionary time frame and cleansing time frame for the mother on behalf of the daughter. Another option that is placed out there is that the time is doubled because two women are involved. And so the mother again takes on the potential defilement of her daughter. Either of these are probably helpful to understand that the mother is kind of caring for the potential defilement of the daughter until the daughter is responsible enough to take care of that for herself. As we move into Leviticus chapter 13, we begin to see the passages on skin diseases. Now, skin diseases are mainly concerned with spreading diseases, raw flesh, and white-haired diseases that cause the hair in the body to become white. And the priest would observe the skin disease. And unfortunately, and this kind of goes back to the King James, and a lot of versions of kind of English versions of scripture still rely heavily on some of the terminology that has been established through the King James, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but certainly we have kind of a better updated idea of some of what's happening here. The skin diseases are not constrained to leprosy. Leprosy is actually fairly uncommon, not unheard of, but uncommon in biblical cultures. So leprosy was possible, but it probably was far broader. And so that's why I'm using the term skin disease, despite the fact that many versions are going to use the term leprosy. So we don't want to narrow it down to just leprosy. It's actually quite broader than that. And so the priest would observe the skin disease, and some results required immediate declaration of uncleanness. Others required a longer observation for a declaration, whether clean or unclean. But in none of this, interestingly, is healing the goal. You'll notice that nowhere is it talking about how to heal the skin disease. Rather, the goal, the concern for the Levite is a return to either that common or the clean area, right? So there's a return to that which is at issue here. So the person was welcome to use whatever medical opportunities that were available to them to assist them with the skin disease, but they were unclean until that happened. And so really the goal here has less to do with healing, not that God doesn't want healing to occur, but in the Levitical law, we're not really looking at the concern of healing, although that would be a broader biblical principle and goal. Here, we're concerned about the people coming into the presence of holy God. While unclean, the individual must be separated from both God and from a distance to community. And this is primarily both hygienic to keep the skin disease from spreading to other people, but also a representation that uncleanness can spread, and therefore the community becomes unclean from God and now places the entire community at risk of being unclean. Essentially, bodily diseases are incompatible with the holy presence of God and must be removed if we are to be in his presence. And we even hold to that as believers in the New Testament, although we would not approach it in quite the same way that the law does. Don't we all long for the day when these bodily diseases will no longer be an issue, when we will have the new bodies that are ours through the resurrection of Jesus Christ and for eternity? And then we can be in the holy presence of God. But those bodily diseases, these frailties and infirmities of our body, need to be removed if we are to be in his presence forever. The next aspect of chapter 13 is the concern over spreading molds. And spreading molds are unclean. So if we have spreading diseases, which are spread, or skin diseases, which are part of humanity's issue, the spreading molds are concerned with kind of creation, and specifically household and clothing and other types of items that would be consistently around humans. Well, spreading molds are unclean. They need to be reported to the priest. And the mold was tested by the priest, with failed tests being burned and past tests being cleansed or restored. And again, the lesson here is that decay or contamination is incompatible with the holy presence of God and must be removed if he is to be present in his creation. And again, if we want to see God in creation, all the brokenness of this world, the decay, the contamination, it's not compatible with his holy presence. And so we need a new heaven. We need a new earth. Again, in the New Testament, we have the assurance of looking forward to God making that new heaven and new earth where there is no more decay or contamination, because it is now removed so that his holy presence can be present. So in chapter 14, we get the what do we do? How do we get cleansed from these skin diseases and these molds? Leviticus 13 is, if you read it all by itself, it's a little bleak in its focus on separation due to pollution. This chapter shows that God ultimately is seeking sanctification and unification with his people. So God does not want to leave his people in those polluted, unclean places. He wants to see them cleansed and sanctified and in his holy presence. And so while 13 might feel a little bleak in terms of what is done, the question becomes, how do we get cleansed from these defiling skin diseases? Well, pagan religions of the time had priests who, through some form of cultic magic or exorcism, would seek to remove this sickness. And we even see that in contemporary times. For animistic cultures, oftentimes there's a shaman who will come in and do some kind of cultic magic or exorcism in order to remove sickness. Well, here, the Israelite is free to pursue any medical assistance. It has to be non-pagan, so they can't go to the shaman or use cultic magic or exorcism. But they can use whatever medical assistance they want. They're free to pursue that, which is different than the pagan religions around them. And so what is spoken of here is, again, not really medically prescriptive. The medical aspect of it, the healing aspect of it, although a very biblical principle, is not really the focus of what we're looking at in Leviticus 13 and 14. And when we try to place it on that medical side, we come to all sorts of wrong conclusions. Instead, we want to keep that picture in mind of the clean and the unclean. It's the renewal to sanctification so that one could come into God's holy presence. And so there is a restoration to the community in verses 3-9 of the chapter, where the person with a skin disease is presented to the priest for examination outside the camp. And that person presented 2 birds. One was sacrificed, and that blood was mixed with fresh running water. So this had to be like a water from a brook or a river, something that is fresh water as opposed to something that's been stagnant. And so the blood of the first bird, after its sacrifice, is mixed with that fresh running water. And then the blood was sprinkled on the presenter, the person who had the skin disease. And this represented the outcome of death without healing from God. So the bird represented, this is what happens if you aren't healed from God. But the second bird, along with some cedar and hyssop. Hyssop is a kind of a small, scraggly plant. It's used for a number of different types of plants throughout Scripture. But generally speaking, it's kind of somewhat of a willowy type of a plant that you could use to kind of sprinkle something from. And the cedar and the hyssop apparently seem to be tied together with the scarlet thread. And then that is dipped into the blood water and again sprinkled onto the presenter. Cedar is used possibly because it's durable. It represents strength, and the hyssop is used for the sprinkling. And the scarlet thread, of course, represents because it's red, it represents the blood of the purifying sacrifice. And so you're kind of bringing strength and God's sprinkling of that sacrifice upon the person, as well as the blood of that sacrifice, kind of all together in this particular ritual. That bird, that second bird, after it's been dipped in the water and the person has been sprinkled, is set free. And that bird represents kind of the removal of the disease from the person. Now, remember, this person has already presented themselves to the priest as being clean and in need of cleansing. So the bird being let free doesn't, magically take away the disease. It's presumed at this point that the person has already, that the priest has already recognized that the person is no longer has their skin disease. So the bird is not magically taking away the disease, but it is certainly representing that removal of the disease from the person. But the person is shaved and washed, and they stay outside the camp for 7 days just to confirm the healing. And then they would bring several sacrifices to the tabernacle. They'd bring a restitution sacrifice, and that covered any covenant obligations that may have been missed during the sickness. And some of the blood of that restitution sacrifice was placed on the body of the person, which represented their sanctification. And then also oil was brought and placed on the body of the person, and that represented their consecration. So they have both been sanctified and kind of consecrate, dedicate it back to God through that restitution sacrifice. There's also a burnt sacrifice, which covered the sinfulness of the world, that included the sickness, because it may not be that the person actually sinned in order to get their sickness. It's just part of a broken, sinful world. So the burnt offering kind of covers that sinfulness. They have a purification offering, which restores their relationship to God, and then a peace offering, which celebrate their relationship with God. Notice specifically, nowhere's in here is there a confession of sin. So there is not a presumption. It may be that their sickness was a consequence of a particular sin that they had, but they don't have to confess a sin, because sometimes people just get sick because we live in a sinful world. We are polluted and unclean and contaminated, not because we have done anything, but just because we live in a world that's polluted and contaminated. And so there is no confession of sin anywhere in here. So there is not a presumption that the person's sickness is necessarily due to a particular sin. And of course, at the end of this, the person is restored. And so there is a great celebration, kind of a celebratory feel to the end of this particular or at the end of this particular section of this chapter. Well, also in this chapter, we're dealing with spreading molds. And again, the priest would come in, they would determine whether the item was unclean or not, and determined either replacement of construction or destruction. And here, of course, they're taking specifically a look at houses, because obviously clothing and other types of elements that the molds might get on, it's not that big of a deal, but a house, you don't want to burn and destroy your house for no reason. So the priest determined the uncleanness or cleanness of the spreading mold, and determined either a replacement of portions of the construction, so you could take a wall out, for instance, or the destruction of the entire establishment. If the establishment was determined to be clean, or in time became cleansed after the replacement of construction, then the establishment, the house, needed to be consecrated. And so again, we present two birds, and very similar in terms of one bird being sacrificed, second bird being set free. There being a sprinkling with the cedar, hyssop, and scarlet thread with the blood water. Again, notice no confession of sin. Just because a person has mold in their house doesn't mean that they are falling under the judgment of God, is what this essentially comes down to. As we move into chapter 15, we move back to emissions, bodily emissions. And so we had birth in chapter 12, chapter 13 and 14 deal with skin diseases and molds, and now we go back to bodily emissions. So it's kind of a parallel going on. And so now it's going to deal in Leviticus 15 with uncleanness from different types of bodily emissions. And in a real way, this is very parallel to Leviticus 12, where there are bodily emissions from the birth, as discussed. Notice especially men and women are treated equally here. There is not a sense in which there is a superiority or inferiority of men or women anywhere in this passage. They're treated equally here. There's no confession of sin. There's not a presumption that just because you have some kind of either a chronic or a natural bodily emission that somehow you are committing sin. And in time, because of the cleansing process, this ritual cleansing that this chapter talks about, these public ritual cleansing baths were dug throughout the land in preparation of going to a place of worship, either a synagogue or later in the first century or earlier before the exile, going to the temple or tabernacle. So you have these ritual cleansing baths that still exist today. You go to Israel, you'll archaeologically see these different cleansing baths that people would cleanse themselves before coming into worship of God to ensure that they are cleansed before Him. So in terms of male emissions, you have chronic emissions, which are medically unnatural emissions from men. And in these particular circumstances, all contact needed to be avoided. They needed to wait 7 days to ensure that there is healing if the person presented themselves as healed. Again, knows the presumption that they have been healed. And again, the emphasis here is not on the medical pursuit of that healing, but rather on once they are healed, if they are healed, how do they go from being unclean to being holy? And so all contact in the meantime needed to be avoided. They waited 7 days to ensure that they were healed after presenting themselves to the priest. There's a ritual cleansing with water. And then the person had to offer a purification sacrifice, which would restore their relationship with God, and also a burnt sacrifice that covered the sinfulness of, again, just being in a sinful world that this thing happened to them. You also, for men, have seminal emissions. And in this circumstance, they were unclean till evening with a ritual cleansing. So sex is part of the common, not the holy. We, our culture, we have kind of raised the sexual relationship to kind of a holy or a sacred type of a place because of many of the idols that we worship in our culture. Sex is not part of the holy. In fact, Scripture is very clear that we will not have sex in eternity. When we are in the presence of God, sex will not be part of that particular relationship that we have with other people. So sex is part of the common. It's not evil. It's not inherently unclean. It is something that was established by God, but it is part of the common. In other words, God was separating sex, which is established by Him. He, brought Adam and Eve together. So sex is established by Him, but God does not want sex syncretizing into ritual worship. In other words, for sex and sexuality to become a part of worship, like the pagans that were around the Israelites, because fertility really, which is typically the fertility is usually the aspect that most syncretizes into ritual worship. Fertility comes from God, not from the ritual worship. And so there is to be no sex as part of the ritual worship of God. And so seminal emissions from men made them unclean, not because they have been sinful in any way, but because that uncleanness, sex, was not to be a part of the holy worship of God. And so they were unclean till evening with a simple ritual cleansing. It's not really all that difficult of a thing and could be dealt with very easily. Similarly, with female emissions, again, the menstrual emissions represents kind of dying blood. It's not life-giving blood. Um, and that's different than the living blood sacrifices that are being brought into the tabernacle all the time. And that living blood sacrifice, which are prescribed by God, are the only blood that is allowed before God. And so menstrual emissions represents kind of a dying blood rather than life-giving blood, and thus does not represent the holy. And for women, they are unclean for 7 days. It's a longer time frame. They can't just cleanse themselves at night, because obviously a menstrual period will take multiple days, but they are unclean for 7 days. And then after that 7 days, they can have a ritual cleansing, just like the men. And so it's recognized that this is going to be a common element of being unclean. It's not sinful, but with ritual cleansing, the uncleanness could be taken away. In the situation of chronic emissions for women, again, we see very similar to men. All contact needed to be avoided. If they felt that they were healed, they would present themselves to a priest. They'd wait 7 days to ensure healing. There's a ritual cleansing with water. A purification sacrifice restored their relationship with God. A burnt offering sacrifice covered the sinfulness of the world that included the sickness. Again, not because the emissions, the chronic emissions, were necessarily anything that they had done, but recognize that this is just a sinful world. We get a very specific situation of this in the New Testament, where Jesus and a woman who has a bleeding issue throughout her life, well, for several years, Jesus really becomes the one who restores her relationship with God and covered the sinfulness that had inflicted her. He is her purification sacrifice. He is her burnt sacrifice. And so we begin to see how Jesus, in very specific ways, is dealing with this idea of how do we bring unclean people into the holy presence of God, whether or not sin was a part of the reason why they have the situation that they have. So we see a lot of parallels here between men and women in terms of these various emissions that not necessarily because of sin, but made them unclean and unable to come into the presence of God. So God established, he wants his people to come into his presence. And so he establishes ways of cleansing and sanctification so that they can come into his presence. Well, in chapter 16, we get to a chapter on the Day of Atonement. And this actually really culminates chapters 12 through 15, since it is the once-a-year covering of all outstanding sin and defilement. What if I didn't cleanse myself one time? What if I didn't recognize, the skin disease? What happens to people if they miss something? And the Day of Atonement is a once-a-year covering of all outstanding sin and defilement. And we're going to go into more detail in that in next week's summary, because we're going to get to Leviticus chapter 23, which goes over all the festivals. And I really want to talk about the Day of Atonement in its context of the rest of the festivals. But it's important to note here that throughout the year, it's really too difficult to address every sin and every defilement. This really represented a renewal for all the people, the priests, the place of worship, so that the access, which is normally very limited, especially the access to the Holy of Holies, is very limited. This particular ritual or festival really allows kind of a humble access on the part of the priest, prescribes specific ritual sacrifices, and really one very unique type of sacrifice in this case, for restoring everything back. And this included, interestingly, the people themselves, in terms of how they spent the day on the Day of Atonement. But we're going to get to that next week's summary, because that really places it into the context of the festivals. When we get to chapter 17, we see that God is very clear that sacrifices could only be offered at the place of worship. So you can't set up all these different places of sacrifice. The place of worship is the place where sacrifices are, because that's where the place of God is. Not that God isn't everywhere, but his unique focused presence is in that place of worship. Additionally, in chapter 17, no blood was to be eaten because blood represented life, and all of life is God's. And this probably not only is partially there because of God's deep concern and value for all of human life, but also in pagan practices, sometimes the life of the animal blood, or even in human sacrifice, the human blood, somebody would drink that, thinking that they would get the life force of that particular person. Well, no blood was to be eaten because blood represented life, and all of life is God's, not ours to be taken. When we get to chapter 18, we have a number of different unlawful sexual relations. And once again, what I want to do is bring up a table that is available for you on the Sky Valley Chapel.com website under Bible study. And this particular table, I think, will be helpful for us as we think through sexuality. So I'm not going to go through chapter 18 in detail. Rather, what I'm going to do is show you this particular table, which helps us to be able to see the way in which sex is understood, sexuality is understood. So at the top of that table, we see that sexuality is a part of creation order. It's a major part of God's good creation, but it is not part of the divinity. So God is not defined in any way by sexuality, nor is it used, as we've already seen today, in worship of him. And so anytime you have this cultic sexuality, that it distorts what God intended for sexuality. And really, in the Old Testament, there is way too many verses in the Old Testament to even begin to, it talks about all the different pagan practices of the nations around them, and many of those practices included some type of cultic sexuality. When we get to the topic of heterosexual duality in marriage, Genesis 1 and 2 clearly define male and female distinction as being fundamental to humanity. And so therefore, homosexuality, transvestism, and bestiality diverge from that fundamental aspect of humanity as described in Genesis 1 and 2. Monogamous marriage is described in Genesis chapter 2, one man and one woman. And even throughout Scripture and even into our own day, we see polygamy and concubinage as a part of marriage. This is not the way that God originally designed marriage to be. What's interesting in Scripture is that there is a significant equality of the sexes. So this really is not a minimizing of men, but an elevation of women throughout most biblical cultures and even into our own day. There is no ontological superiority or inferiority between men and women. They are equal. And so anytime we see the denigration of women, this again is a distortion of what God intended between men and women. Sexuality is supposed to represent the wholeness of the person. So the men and women are both created in the imago Dei, the image of God. Individually, they are created that way. Complementarily, in marriage, they are an expression of the image of God. And communally, men and women together in the community of believers are an imago Dei. So we see these various different ways in which men and women together, individually and together, are part of that image of God that he created all of us with. And so physical and non-physical aspects are in a likeness to God, not because God looks necessarily like a human with arms and legs and whatnot, but the physical and non-physical aspects in some ways represent who God is. In fact, God speaks of himself as having many of these physical and non-physical aspects in himself as a way of showing that we image him. And so there is this oneness between the physical and the non-physical in our in our own life. You know, the difference between the body and the soul and the spirit and the mind and emotions, you know, all of this, there's a oneness that is together. And this also represents the Imago Dei. And then just that psychosocial, psychophysical unity, that kind of that idea that I have found my soulmate, right? This person who connects to me, who makes me whole. But that's all part of a very biblical understanding of sexuality and wholeness. And it's distorted when there is any kind of fragmentation to that wholeness, when we seek our wholeness in prostitution or through mixed marriages or masturbation or various types of sexual blemishes and impurities that are talked about throughout scripture. That wholeness is broken down. Sexuality is also supposed to be exclusive. This idea of leaving, of freedom from interference, both outward and within the relationship itself. And so therefore the distortion becomes adultery and premarital sex, because there is not a freedom. The marital relationship now has interference from these other relationships that have been established in a distorted, fallen view. There's also sexuality and permanence. We are not only to leave, but we are to cling. And this idea is both a covenantal clinging, a vow that is made, as well as an attitudinal clinging. This idea that I'm going to be with this person. And the distortion, of course, of that is seen in both divorce and in remarriage. In terms of sexuality and intimacy, the unity of a man and a woman in marriage is emotional, physical, and spiritual. Sexual intercourse is a sign of the marriage covenant. So it's almost a recovenanting every single time there's that sexual intimacy. And when that type of intimacy is shared with other family members, that's a distortion of what was intended. So incest is a distortion of sexual intimacy. And then marriage also has as one of its outcomes or possible outcomes is procreation. So there is a special divine blessing that comes along with having children, and God commands us to emulate and continue in God's creative work, in part by having children. And so again, a distortion of this is seen in childlessness, children born out of wedlock, and in abortion. And finally, we have this wholesome beauty of sexuality. Part of God's perfect design is this uninhibited, sensuous vulnerability, this intimacy and vulnerability, holy like the Sabbath, holy like the sanctuary, although not used within the holy worship of God. There is a beauty that is reflective. So the relationship between God and his people oftentimes is talked about as being beautiful, that his bride is beautiful, his people are beautiful. And so this wholesome beauty of sexuality really becomes a picture of the type of relationship that we're intended to have through holy worship of God. And of course, rape and any kind of parody of beauty, and our culture has all sorts of parody of beauty that is a part of it. All of this distorts what God intended. Now, I go over this with you because for two reasons. First of all, to recognize that just because there's a distortion, it does not necessarily mean that the distortion is a sin on the part of the person. So, for instance, when we get to childlessness doesn't mean that God doesn't love the person, that God is not blessing that woman, that that woman has sinned in some way in order to be childless. But it is a distortion. So it is part of the sinfulness of this world. It's part of being in a broken world. It's not the way that God intended it to originally be. So some of these distortions are clearly sinful because God declares them sinful in Scripture. Others are simply, again, that kind of idea that this distortion is not really representing the way that God intended things to be. And the sexual laws that we have in chapter 18 follow along with that. So when we think in terms of what is God saying no to, and why is he saying no to it in terms of how it reflects what he intended when he created sex and sexuality and gender, all that kind of stuff. But when he created all that as a very good part of his creation, how is what is going on in chapter 18 a distortion of that? I think the table hopefully will be helpful to you to begin to see how some of those specific laws in chapter 18 are tied to that. Well, when we get to Leviticus chapter 19, we have a review of the law. And it starts with a loyalty to God. God's people must be holy in verse 2. They must keep the whole covenant, verses 3 through 4. They need to seek peace with God in verses 5 through 8. And that required all the sacrifices, again, that sanctification to be in the holy presence of God. But a review of the law is not just a loyalty to God, but it's a loyalty to others. If loyalty to God is claimed, then, for instance, generosity in the form of caring for the poor and providing them means to worship was necessary, as we see in verses 9 and 10. Notice, and we're going to see this come up over and over as we study through Scripture, notice how our love for God is always linked with our love for others. Both are needed. And so not only do we need to be generous, we need to be honest, we must not take advantage of others, we need to preserve justice, we need to act out of love for others, as verses 17 through 18 tell us. And so as we act out of love for others, there will be a loyalty that is shown through justice. There is the laws of mixtures in verse 19. It's hard to know exactly what is happening here, but possibly the mixing that's talked about in verse 19 is an unequally mixing or yoking the strong and the weak in a way in which the weak bears the burden of the union. Traditionally, this particular verse is taken as not mixing with pagan peoples in lifelong commitments. And so this would be seen as more metaphorical, that we need to keep a purity amongst God's people. And I think a mixture of both, no pun intended, but a mixture of both of those, both an understanding of that idea of placing too great of a burden upon the weak, as well as not mixing with those who would influence us away from God, is part of what's being spoken of in verse 19. In verses 20 through 22, there is a loyalty shown through justice and social disparity. So a justice to slaves. Now it's uncertain, but possibly the slave woman in this particular passage of verses 20 through 22 of Leviticus chapter 19 is spoken for. So she's not really betrothed. She's not engaged, since if she was engaged, that would just be adulteress. And there's other laws to deal with adultery, but she is spoken for by another. In our contemporary culture, we might say she was dating, although they didn't really have dating in that time frame as we know it. But she was spoken for, but then her master sleeps with her. So there's not a capital punishment of adultery because she's not really engaged or married. But an inquiry, so there are judges who are supposed to look into this, Levites, an inquiry should exact a due punishment on the master. And this is contextually determined. So God doesn't say there is one way in which you have to do a due punishment, but based on the context. And then a restitution sacrifice is required. And presumably the cost of the woman plus 20% would be paid to her original suitor per the inquiry, as well as making that restitution sacrifice. Because remember, the restitution sacrifice required you to pay what was lost by somebody else. Not exactly the outcome that would be hoped for, but there is a sense in which the woman is being recognized as not just property per se, but that she was connected with this other person. And then it shows us also that slaves and the vulnerable have rights, and they are equal rights to the value to freed people. And so she is cared for in the midst of this particular situation. Also, in justice, you have a justice. This loyalty to justice is loyalty to justice to God and creation. So, in verses 20 through 25, the early years of a fruit tree is normally not its best. And so you wait until you have its best. In this case, the law was the fourth year, and that ensured that God would receive the best first fruits before the person received any. See, it's really easy to give God kind of that first year. Nobody wants to eat the first year of fruit anyway. And so we gave him the first fruits. And then, a couple of years later, we get the best of it. God says, no, if you're not giving me your best, you wait until your best can be given, and then give me your best. And then you can begin to enjoy the blessing of what it is. And I think that that's an important principle for us. Sometimes we're very quick to say, well, I'll just give God that. I really don't want it anyway. It's kind of my pocket change or something that's not really important to me. God says, no, I want what is best from your life. And then as you give to me from your best, you will experience the blessings of being in my presence. Loyalty through the law was also shown through separation of worship. And in verses 26 to 31, you have a number of different laws avoiding various forms of pagan worship. Again, the avoiding of eating blood to gain a life force. When God is silent, we follow the covenant rather than seeking divination or omens or horoscopes or any of the various ways that we try to seek some kind of insight from non-godly people through sorcery or any of those types of means. We ought to keep the natural order by avoiding disfiguration of the body that God has created. We should avoid not only ritual prostitution, but general prostitution. And ultimately recognize that God is in your presence, that we live our life as a Sabbath to God. And of course, tied to that then is avoiding speaking to the dead, because we don't need to speak to the dead. God is in our presence. The chapter kind of concludes with a loyalty shown through kindness to the vulnerable. So respect the elderly, respect the foreigner, respect the consumer. And in the case of these particular verses, the consumer is probably most likely a poor person, so don't take advantage of the poor. Ultimately, all of this shows a loyalty through respecting God. And so in these chapters, we have some difficult material, but material that kind of makes sense when we begin to see the context of it. And so we'll continue in our next week with the more material from the book of Leviticus.